Hi and welcome back to another video. Really appreciate you coming back and checking out my videos if you're a return viewer, and welcome if you're a new one. This week I have already done a video on the different editions of Dungeons and Dragons. Now, get the pitchforks out, but I would like to rank them in order of what is my most favourite. And might I just say that I love all editions of Dungeons and Dragons that I've played. I really like them all, so if I have one ranked lower, it's not because I don't like it or I hate your edition. This is my personal list, and it has no bearing on how good I think your game is or anything like that. And some of these are just games that, some editions, I'll be honest, I haven't played as much. So let's get stuck straight in to my rankings. So first up is Blue Homes. Now, can I just comment, is Blue Homes being at the lowest of my rankings is no slight on Blue Homes. It is I've never owned a copy or ran Blue Homes D&D, which is one of the first editions of Dungeons & Dragons after the original 1974 release. Now, my understanding of Blue Homes is that it was used as a primer before you went on to actually play Advanced Dungeons & Dragons First Edition. So, for me, it had a level limit of just getting to level number 3. It was very basic, and I've just never played it. And so no slight on it, but I could never see myself even running it now because I couldn't really make a campaign out of it to level 3, and it was originally intended as a primer before you went on to Advanced Dungeons & Dragons First Edition. However, this game culturally converted a lot of people to playing Dungeons & Dragons, and it's significant in the history of D&D. And I would love a copy for myself in my collection to read properly, because what I know about it, I've read online, and I'll be totally honest with you. So the placement is due to my own lack of knowledge about it. But for me, it would have to go here. Next up for me, and please don't kill me, I actually have the 1974 Dungeons & Dragons edition. Now, I have read the 1974 game. It is a bit harder to understand because it utilises rules from chainmail, and you had to know a bit of chainmail to know it. When I have run it, I've actually run more OSR clones of it. So those would be like the White Box basic fantasy game, or Iron Falcon by Chris Schoneman, who also makes the basic fantasy RPG game, which is wonderful, might I just say. Now, I love the look of these games, and I would not mind running a 1974 clone or the actual game itself. I really wouldn't mind. What I do find interesting about these early games is, unlike later basic D&D, like the BECMI D&D, is that elves could be a fighter or a magic user, and dwarves were fighters also, and Thief wasn't even a class in the original Dungeons & Dragons. And then in later editions, Dwarf was just the class of basic Dungeons & Dragons. So I found that quite interesting. This early game I would happily run from a group, but I can't personally see me sustaining a campaign with it. Obviously, many people did back in the day, but because we're now spoiled, with the benefit of time passing, if I want to get a bit more advanced, I would go for First Edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, or the BX version, or the BECMI version of Dungeons & Dragons. That's why it's placed here. I think later editions of Dungeons & Dragons are just better than this edition of Dungeons & Dragons. Please do not kill me. And when I say better, I mean better for me to run. There is no objectively better edition of Dungeons & Dragons. It's all subjective, of course it is. So next up on my list, here we go, is 4th edition. Now, I had a hiatus from D&D for a few years, and then I came back to it and decided to see what the modern game was doing. So I purchased myself the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster books. And I delved in, and I found myself playing what to me was a roleplay game, but it was heavily influenced by modern day gaming powers and mechanics. This game is often compared to World of Warcraft online, in that everybody gets a power. There's a big daily power you use once a day, and powers you can use only during encounters, and at will powers you can use all the time. Spells were made into that way as well. It was harder to die than previous editions. Every character had a role, e.g. a tank or area damage or a commander. For me, it was making D&D into strategized combat to the point that you needed a game board in order to use it. And not the classic roleplay game that I used to enjoy when I came back to it. Also, the skill challenge mechanic in it was to me a bit odd and muddled in badly for my taste. It didn't feel quite like the D&D that I was playing. And I played a lot of second edition, to be quite honest with you. So it was a different game to me. Also, leveling up after a few levels I found to be quite complicated, and I often would calculate the bonuses wrong unless I did it online with what was an early version. Oh, wasn't D&D Beyond, but it was something that would calculate your character's levels, and then I found that would do it totally different to how I was doing it, but maybe that's just me being bad at maths. Again, I don't hate 4th edition. If someone was running it, I'd sit down and play it. I wouldn't mind, but it wouldn't be my go-to edition. And at later levels, the combat could take the whole session, to be quite honest with you. So it's just not for me, though I wouldn't mind a foray into it every now and then. Now, next up for me, if you haven't stopped the video and raged at me yet, you will now, because here I'm going to place 3rd edition, which I think is a good place to put it. And there's a reason 3rd edition is popular, and they remade 3rd edition into Pathfinder, because when 4th edition came out, people didn't like it. They like 3rd edition, and that goes to show the staying power of 3rd edition, because it's still played to this day. And when I say 3rd edition, I'm clumping 3 and 3.5 together. I simply didn't play loads of 3rd edition. I've played some 3rd edition in its 3rd edition form or Pathfinder form. More as Pathfinder, to be honest with you, nowadays. However, as I remember, they did a whole nice job of the D20 system, and there was a whole system change from the older D&D to this newer system, which is what it's based on to this day. So we went from the classic percentile dice rolls for some abilities, random rolling of a d6 to see if you found a secret door, to the d20 system. They actually did want to change it to a more d20 roll high when designing 2nd edition, but they decided against it as they felt players not be able to handle this change. And they were correct, because some people never wanted to play 3rd edition. They prefer older editions, hence the OSR movement today, because people love those old editions, and they want to stick with that, and that's fine. However, many people did like the new editions, and as alluded to, it gave the core mechanic of rolling a d20 and adding a modifier to that roll compared to what skill you were using, what ability. It introduced feats, prestige classes, skills. Old D&D did have the equivalent of skills, but not quite the same way that 3rd edition would utilise it going forward. AC was an ascending order instead of descending order. This is the birth of the game as we know it in its current form, and a lot of people like this style of the game. And you can't argue with the numbers. Pathfinder sells really well. 5th edition is based heavily on this edition as well, and that game sells very well. You can't argue with the numbers. It's a good game. I've put it here because I haven't overly played a lot of it. I have played some of it, but I do know I like it better than 4th edition. So that's why it's here. So next up, it was a toss-up between BECMI or Rules Cyclopedia D&D and Mulvey D&D. A lot of people love Mulvey D&D. A lot of OSR fans absolutely love Mulvey D&D. And I love Mulvey D&D too. The way the book was written was a nice introductory book to help people learn how to play the game, but it was also great to reference in that book. It was brilliant, and you could reference in that book, and it was great if you needed to look up rules. The BECMI version of D&D was more like teaching you to play as you read along, and it would have been harder to reference the rule you want, I feel, in the BECMI edition. Not so much if you had the rule cyclopedia to look at, but if you were going off the BECMI red box and the Mulvey basic box, the Mulvey one is much easier to reference from. I think I'm going to put BECMI D&D in this slot because I love BECMI D&D. It is the edition that I started with for basic D&D, and I do love it, and I love everything about BECMI Rule Cyclopedia D&D. It's just a wonderful game. There are skills in it that they added to it in the Rule Cyclopedia and in other editions that players could use that you didn't have that in other editions of D&D. It's just an absolutely wonderful game. There's so much added to it that it might as well be an advanced Dungeons and Dragons game as far as I'm concerned, once you add all the Rule Cyclopedia-ness to it. But we're now going to move on to Mulvey as my next ranking. And Mulvey is basic Dungeons and Dragons in a nutshell. For lots of players of that generation, if you thought of D&D, it's Mulvey D&D. It is as alluded to in a video before, it's just a wonderful edition of old D&D. And also, as an interest, Mulvey D&D, the thieves were more powerful than they were in Beckme. They got nerfed in the Beckme edition of D&D. Mulvey D&D had no feats or skills that were to come later on. It was basic D&D. So whilst I do rate Mulvey above Beckme, maybe it's more for the nostalgia reason. Because if I were to run a campaign, I'd actually run it in Beckme. And we're now heading into the home straight, because I've got 3 left. I've got 5th edition, 2nd edition, and 1st edition Dungeons & Dragons. Where am I going to put them? Well, let's delve in and find out. So first off, in 3rd place for me is 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. And being 3rd is no mean feat. I absolutely love Beckme, which I place below it. I'll run Beckme any day of the week. I'll run Mulvey any day of the week. I'll run any version of Dungeons & Dragons any day of the week. So having this in 3rd for me, it's still a brilliant game. It's the newest, most popular version of the game that there has ever been. The cultural impact of 5th edition on modern gaming is massive compared to lots of other editions of Dungeons & Dragons. It is huge. It is a big game, and you can't take anything away from that. The combat is, I think, great when it's implemented well. You have skills for roleplay, like the magic system in it. All of it is great. However, I actually had someone comment on one of my videos that they had a fight with Lolth, the Spider Queen goddess. Their group fought her and then had a fight with an ancient green dragon afterwards with a short rest. Beat both of them. That to me screams there's a lot of heroicness, overpoweredness going on here. For my tastes, and this is for my tastes obviously, and what I think doesn't necessarily matter to you, and it's not necessarily the one true way of playing D&D. But for my taste, that's a bit much. Or you could have that fight and then rest up for 8 hours and then everybody's ready to go like nothing ever happened. That's the part of Dungeons & Dragons, new Dungeons & Dragons, I do have a problem with. I think healing and stakes aren't very high. Not that I want to just wipe out the party either. I've already had a bit of a rant about this in previous videos. That's my problem with 5th edition. But the pros outweigh the cons. You've got great builds that you can make for your characters. There's so many different builds you can have with those characters. And a lot of people like making character builds. I enjoy it. I love making a new build for my character. It's wonderful. I like the roleplay aspect of it, of the skills used. Not too many skills, not too little skills for my taste. I like the simplicity of the resolution of those skill mechanics. I love the way the game is just laid out and all the different books available for it and all the different resources and just how the game's played. And I've had many a wonderful time with friends playing Dungeons & Dragons. If we could only just sort out the deadliness. Anyway, on to the next one. So next up for me is the edition that I first ever started with, I first ever played. It's Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition. One day my mum comes home and she brings me a book from a yard sale, car boot sale that she bought, and I opened it up and I read it, and it's the Old Player's Handbook 2nd edition with the fighter riding the horse at you. And that started my love for Dungeons & Dragons. And the system, there would obviously be a bias in here for me because it's my first system and I totally recognise that. But for me, learning it, all the different character classes, all the combinations of character classes, the weapons, just the fantasy, the artwork in the 2nd edition book is still my favourite artwork by far out of any other editions. I love the artwork in all the 2nd edition books. It's where my heart lies for passion for Dungeons & Dragons. When I think of Dungeons & Dragons, I think of 2nd edition artwork or indeed Beckme artwork. Those are the things that stay with me. Game system-wise, the amount of spells, the amount of books that came out for 2nd edition to help with it. So many Tome of Spells added so many spells which I still own to this day. All the extra manuals, like at least for fighters, for clerics, for wizards, handbooks for each. All these things were wonderful, and I own so many of them, and unfortunately I don't own as many anymore, and I miss that. But this edition of Dungeons & Dragons, I said in my last video about editions that there's minimalist difference between 2nd and 1st edition, and I still stick by that, but there are changes if you delve into it, but they are very similar games. So obviously at number 1 place for me If you're going to play Dungeons and Dragons, you better do it right. And you better play it how Gary wants you to play it. First edition Dungeons and Dragons is Gary Gygax's Dungeons and Dragons. He wrote this book out, and this is how he wanted you to play it. And by God, you better play it how Gary wants you to play it. And so this is why I put it at number 1. If you look at the artwork for this book, this is... I said I love second edition artwork, but the artwork in first edition is wonderful. There's some early artwork, which is quite basic. There's some iconic picture of the demon with the group who's just finished an adventure and they're trying to prize out the gem from the head of the demon, and you can just imagine that going wrong and the demon statue coming to life or something like that. Just how the game is played, the quirkiness of the rule book to me. If you read Dungeon Master's Guide, it's quirky. It's written as often called High Gygaxian because Gary Gygax wrote the whole thing himself. And the way it's written, it's a great book. You could get lost in it a bit for how it's written, to be honest, with details of bell curves and things like that. But it's a wonderful book. It's steeped in history, and it is how Gary really wanted you to play it. This is how he wanted you to play it. So if you want to play Dungeons and Dragons how I feel Gary wanted you to play it, it would be first edition Dungeons and Dragons. And this is the edition you should play. If you wanted to play first edition Dungeons and Dragons modernly, if that's a word, I would recommend playing Osric, OSRIC, which is a really simplified version of Dungeons and Dragons Advanced, made so that you can understand it much better. And when I say simplified, I don't mean it's a more simple game. Osric is just more understandable for rules reading if you wanted to play Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And I've got a couple of copies of it, and I like reading it, and it really helps me understand the game mechanics more. That being said, if it was the early 90s and my mother had come back from a sale and brought me the first edition Player's Handbook as opposed to the second edition Player's Handbook, I can't tell you if I'd have understood it as well. The second edition was definitely more understandable for somebody new coming into the hobby. As somebody who's used to the hobby now, used to playing it, I love first edition and very, very much is why it's top. But as a primer to get somebody into it, no, I don't feel, for me, it was very understandable. And you needed to progress from Blue Homes, which I placed all the way back at the bottom. There's a reason that was made to get people into and to be able to understand these more advanced mechanics. It was made as a book that you'd already know how to play Dungeons and Dragons from. So keep that in mind. Anyway, thank you for watching this video. Really appreciate the likes, just the watches, if you subscribe, just any interaction. I really appreciate it. And if you've made it this far, thank you ever so much. I'm in my 18th minute, so that seems like the perfect time to go play Red Dead Redemption. It's my favourite game with the Deadeye targeting system. Bye-bye.